In this session, we are going to study another important issue called clustering tendency. What is clustering tendency? That means we want to study whether the data sets we have really contain clusters. That means whether the data contains some inherent grouping structure. Otherwise, even use random generated data, you may find a certain number of clusters. However, it does not really make sense. That means we want to assess whether the data is suitable for clustering. However, to determine the clustering tendency or clusterability is a hard task, just because there are so many definitions of clusters. For example, we studied partitioning methods, hierarchical methods, density-based methods, graph-based methods. All these different methods may have different definitions of clusters. That's why to study whether the data is clusterable or not is pretty hard. However, even we just fix the cluster type, for example, we just study the partitioning methods, it is still hard to define an appropriate NAR model for a data set. However, there are still some studies on clusterability assessment. For example, there are methods like spatial histogram method, distance distribution method, or Hopkins statistic. The general philosophy is they try to compare their measure with the measure generated from random samples to see whether they are rather different. For example, for spatial histogram method, is try to contrast the histogram of the data with the histogram generated from the random sample to see whether they are rather different. Okay. For distance distribution, is try to compare the pairwise point distance from the data and the pairwise distance from the randomly generated samples. Hopkins statistic is to use a sparse sampling test for spatial randomness. And since they carry a quite similar spirit, we will only introduce one, spatial histogram method. For spatial histogram approach, the general philosophy is we try to construct a d-dimensional histogram of the input. For example, this is a 2D, we may construct a two-dimensional histogram for the input data set D with a histogram generated from random samples. That means we want to compare the figure generated from the left and that generated from the right figure. Okay. The data is clusterable if these two histogram distributions are rather different. That means they really generate very different distribution, then likely this data set is clusterable. Okay. The concrete method is we try to divide each dimension into equal width bins. Then we try to see each cell here, how many points are in the set. Then we can generate empirical joint probability mass function. Okay. Then for the random generated data sets, we'll do the same. We'll generate empirical joint probability mass function. Then what we will do is we try to compare whether these two, they differ quite a lot. That means we want to compare how much they differ. The typical method is we use K-error divergence. That means we calculate the K-error divergence value. The K-error divergence is Kullback-Leibler divergence is defined based on some formulas. I'm not going to introduce the detail of K-error divergence. If you want to learn more, you can check any textbook in statistics or machine learning or data mining. In general, they introduce this measure. Then you find if they are very different then from the random samples, then you will say this data set is clusterable. Okay. Finally, I'm going to introduce a few textbooks, chapters, or journal papers. They discuss the clustering validation measures. Especially what it shows, this one is a summary of many research papers, and Zaki's book gives a lot of details on other measures we did not cover in this lecture. Thank you.